Every Tuesday at 11:45 in the morning, a 72-year-old woman with Alzheimer's walked into the fourth floor of a building in downtown Boston, carrying a lunchbox wrapped in cloth. She believed her son was an accountant. She'd pat his wrinkled shirt, tell him to ask for a raise, and remind him to eat everything she'd packed because he looked too thin. What she didn't know was that 15 men sitting at those desks weren't accountants. They were members of one of the most dangerous crime families on the East Coast. The spreadsheets on their screens were fake. The phone calls were fake. The entire floor existed for one reason: so a mother could believe her son was a good man. Sawyer Corsetti was 37 years old. He controlled a network that moved more money in a week than most corporations moved in a quarter. He'd ordered men killed without blinking. But every Tuesday, he buttoned a cheap dress shirt, sat at a rented desk, and ate his mother's beef stew with a plastic fork while she told him about the neighbor's cat. His right hand, the one he'd used to break a man's jaw 3 days ago, held a lunchbox note that said, "Mom loves you. Eat everything." He folded it and put it in his wallet. He had 11 of them in there. He'd never thrown one away. The men around him called him boss. His mother called him, "my poor baby." She wasn't wrong about the poor part, not in the way she thought, but in every way that mattered. What happened next took 7 days, and it changed everything, not just for the most feared man in Boston, but for a quiet girl in a small town who'd learned to read people the way others read weather, and who noticed, the very first morning, that his watch cost more than her house. If a man who's built an empire on blood and silence learning to hold a hammer instead of a gun does something to you that you can't quite name, hit subscribe and stay. If someone in your life has ever pretended to be less than they are just to keep someone they love from worrying, share this with them. They'll understand. And if you felt that, really felt it, drop a like so we know you're here. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning, 11:45, 4th floor, downtown Boston, because what Maggie Corsetti carried in that lunchbox wasn't just beef stew. It was the only thing in her son's life that was real. But to understand why everything ran so smoothly, we need to go back a little, to the moment Maggie Corsetti called to say she was on her way. Every time she called, she always gave exactly 30 minutes notice. Not earlier, not later. She called because she was polite, because she had been an elementary school teacher for 30 years, and she believed decent people didn't show up at someone else's workplace without warning. She didn't know that those 30 minutes were all Finch Holloway needed. Finch was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a face that never showed emotion, and he had been Sawyer's right-hand man since the very first days the empire was built. He had once arranged cross-state executions, money laundering operations through 4 layers of intermediaries, and disappearances that left no trace behind. But none of that was as complicated as turning an empty floor into an accounting firm in 22 minutes. The process began with a coded message sent to a private group chat, a single word only. Immediately, 15 men from every floor of the Corsetti Holdings building dropped whatever they were doing, changed clothes, and moved up to the 4th floor. Preston Kearney, 45 years old, the organization's financial manager, carried the heaviest burden. He had to print fake financial reports, fake payroll sheets, fake revenue charts, all under the name of an accounting firm that didn't exist in real life, but had a full set of documents sitting in Sawyer's desk drawer. Preston hated Tuesdays. He told Finch he'd rather face a federal audit than print one more quarterly report for Maggie to read. But he still printed them. Every Tuesday, without missing a single time. Then there was Bennett Crane, 29 years old. His hands had taken the lives of 11 people since he joined the organization at 19. He was the most dangerous man in the room, and also the best actor. Every Tuesday, he put on a navy suit, wore round framed glasses with no prescription, sat at the desk by the window, and when Maggie walked in, he stood, bowed politely, and said, "Hello, Aunt Maggie, how are you?" in a voice no one in the basement had ever heard him use. Maggie liked Bennett. She said he was well-mannered, that his parents must have raised him well. She remembered everyone's fake name. She checked on every desk. She remembered that Dave in the corner had caught a cold the week before and asked whether he was feeling better. Dave was actually a debt collector named Keegan, and he had never had a cold in his life. But he nodded and thanked her for asking. Everything ran smoothly, until one Tuesday, Maggie stopped in front of Bennett's desk longer than usual. She tilted her head. She looked at him closely. "You?" she said. "You look familiar. Where have I seen you before?" Bennett didn't move. Inside him, everything froze. 2 years earlier, his face had appeared on the evening news of a local station in connection with a shooting in South Boston. The report showed him for exactly 3 seconds, but sometimes 3 seconds was more than enough. Sawyer stood 4 steps away. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at Bennett. He simply said, perfectly casually, "Bennett was a university junior who worked with me in my previous firm, Mom. I already introduced him to you, remember? You forgot." Maggie looked at Sawyer, then at Bennett, and then she smiled. "Oh, that's right. I do forget things." She patted Bennett on the shoulder and moved on to another desk. Bennett breathed out. His hand under the table was shaking. It was the first time in many years that his hand had shaken because of something that wasn't a gun. Then Maggie left. Wallace Briggs, 55 years old, a former boxer and her personal driver, escorted her out to the car. She waved goodbye to her son's co-workers through the window. 15 men waved back. The elevator doors closed. The 4th floor instantly returned to being empty. Computers shut down. Desks and chairs were pushed into the corner. Dress shoes were changed for tactical boots. Suits were hung back in the closet. The accounting firm disappeared in 7 minutes, faster than it had appeared. Sawyer didn't stay on the 4th floor. He went down to the basement. He passed through the steel door his mother didn't know existed, into the room where the fluorescent lights never went out, where territory maps hung on the walls, and the smell of old coffee mixed with the smell of half-burned cigarettes. On his desk, there were 2 things. On the left was the lunchbox his mother had brought, still neatly wrapped in cloth, with a little warmth still clinging to it. On the right was a black folder, and inside it was the execution order for arrival in Dorchester that week, along with photographs, an address, a travel schedule, and an exit plan. Sawyer sat down. He looked at both of them. He reached to the right, opened the black folder, and began to read. The lunchbox lay on the left, unopened, still warm, still waiting. Sawyer did finally open that lunchbox, at 2 o'clock in the morning, after the black folder had been approved and the order had been sent out. He ate cold beef stew in the basement alone beneath the fluorescent lights. But that wasn't what kept him awake that night. What kept him awake was what began happening on the Tuesdays after that. Those moments when Maggie suddenly became lucid with no pattern at all, as if her brain sometimes flipped a switch no one could predict, not even her. The first time happened the very next Tuesday. Maggie was sitting beside Sawyer's desk, opening the lunchbox while telling him about the neighbor's new dog that barked too much, and then she stopped in the middle of the sentence. She was no longer looking at the lunchbox. She looked straight into Sawyer's eyes with eyes he almost didn't recognize. Bright, sharp, focused. Nothing like the clouded eyes he had grown used to over the past 5 years. "Your father used to lie to me too," she said, her voice gentle but every word clear. "I know the smell of a lie. It's like cheap perfume. People think it can cover things up, but everyone can smell it." Sawyer didn't move. Around him, the 15 men sitting there pretending to work didn't move either. The room went so quiet they could hear the wall clock ticking. Then 5 minutes later, Maggie blinked, looked down at the lunchbox, and asked, "What was I saying?" "Oh, the neighbor's dog. It barks all night." She forgot, but Sawyer didn't. He remembered every word. He remembered the way she said lie, as if she were talking about something specific, not some vague idea. He remembered, and he began to feel afraid. The second time happened 2 weeks later, and this time it was much worse. Maggie was being led by Wallace onto the 4th floor when Finch walked past the hallway on his way down to the basement. Finch was never supposed to be on the 4th floor when Maggie came. That was the rule, because he wasn't on the list of co-workers, and Maggie had never been introduced to him. But that day the elevator was malfunctioning. Finch had to take the stairs, and he came face to face with Maggie in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. He lowered his head, walked quickly past, and said nothing. Maggie watched him go. Then she said, very clearly, "Finch." Finch stopped. He didn't turn around. His back went cold. No one, not a single person in this building, had ever said his name in front of Maggie. His name didn't appear on any nameplate, business card, or conversation she could have overheard. She couldn't possibly know his name, but she had just called him correctly. "Mr. Finch," Maggie continued, "next time, remember to bow to your elders." Then she turned to Wallace, asked whether it was going to rain today, and stepped onto the 4th floor, as if nothing had happened. Finch stood in the stairwell for 2 more minutes before moving on. That night, he met Sawyer in the basement. He told him what had happened. Sawyer didn't seem surprised. He only sat in silence for a very long time, then said something Finch didn't expect. "I'm afraid my mother will wake up, Finch. More afraid than I am of Kane." Finch understood. Kane could take Sawyer's life, but Maggie waking up could take away the only thing Sawyer still had left, the illusion that he was still the son she trusted. Kane could destroy the body. Maggie waking up could destroy the reason Sawyer still wanted to keep that body intact. Then the thing Sawyer feared most finally came. One Tuesday afternoon, after finishing lunch, Maggie didn't get up to leave as she usually did. She stayed seated. She held Sawyer's hand. Her eyes were bright again, that brightness he had learned to recognize and had learned to fear. "Sawyer," she said, "I want you to take a week off. Come home with me, back to Cedar Hollow." He opened his mouth, ready to say the familiar lines. Work was busy. It was the end of the quarter. His boss wouldn't allow it, but she tightened her grip on his hand and went on. "I don't have many lucid days left, son." That sentence stopped every lie he had prepared. She knew she was losing her mind. She knew those moments of clarity were becoming fewer and farther between, and she was using one of those precious moments to ask her son for 1 week. Sawyer didn't answer her right away. He took her home, then returned to the basement to see Finch. He said his mother wanted to go to Cedar Hollow for 1 week. Finch looked at him as if he had just said he was going to turn himself in to the federal police. "No," Finch said bluntly. "You leave Boston for 1 week, and you expose your flank to Kane. The network needs you here. Every day you're gone is a day Kane can swallow another piece of territory." Finch wasn't wrong. Everett Kane, 50 years old, who controlled New England, had been waiting for an opening from Sawyer for 2 years. A week of Sawyer's absence would be a feast for Kane. Finch knew that. Sawyer knew it too. But Sawyer looked at Finch, and there was no hesitation in his eyes. "Arrange it," he said. 2 words. No explanation. No discussion. Finch looked at him for a few more seconds. He had been beside Sawyer for a long time, had heard him give orders to kill men in a calmer voice than that. But the 2 words, "arrange it today," carried more weight than any order he had ever heard, because Finch understood that it wasn't a request. It was a decision that had been made from the moment Maggie said, "I don't have many lucid days left, and nothing in this world, not Kane, not territory, not a network worth hundreds of millions of dollars, could change it." Finch needed 3 days to arrange everything. He assigned temporary decision-makers, set up encrypted communication channels so Sawyer could monitor things from a distance, and most importantly, chose who would go with him. Bennett Crane was chosen, along with another bodyguard, and both of them would play the role of Sawyer's co-workers going on vacation with him. But before the trip could begin, Sawyer had to take Maggie around the city to do a few things: buy supplies, arrange her medication, and pack luggage. And it was during that ordinary afternoon of preparation that everything nearly fell apart. Sawyer was driving, Maggie sat in the passenger seat, and Bennett sat in the back. They were stopped at a red light at the corner of Tremont Street and Boylston Street, a crowded area near Boston Common, when Maggie looked through the window and saw a young woman walking along the sidewalk as a man ran up from behind and yanked the purse clean off her shoulder. The girl fell, screaming. The thief ran toward the alley across the street. Maggie slapped her hand against the window. "Sawyer! That girl! He stole her purse!" she cried out, her voice panicked, her aging eyes wide as they looked at the scene in front of her and couldn't bear it. Sawyer looked through the glass. He saw the thief. He saw the alley. And in his mind, it wasn't the instinct of an accountant that came alive, but something else, something that 2 decades in the underworld had sharpened so deeply that it reacted before thought could even form. He turned off the engine, opened the car door, and ran. Bennett rose halfway from the back seat, his mouth opening as if he meant to say something, but Sawyer had already vanished into the alley. Bennett looked over at Maggie. She was watching her son, both hands clasped in front of her chest, her eyes shining. He couldn't leave her there alone. He also couldn't leave Sawyer alone in the alley. He chose to stay with Maggie, his hand gripping the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. In the alley, Sawyer caught up with the thief in less than 15 seconds. The thief turned, saw a man in a wrinkled shirt charging toward him, and decided to pull a knife. That was the only wrong decision he needed to make. Sawyer knocked the knife hand aside with a movement no accounting school on earth had ever taught, turned his body, drove his elbow into the man's ribs, then slammed him down onto the concrete. The thief lay face down, Sawyer's hand already at the back of his neck, and in that instant, 2 decades of instinct spoke. His fingers found the exact place on the neck, the exact angle, the exact force. All it would take was one twist. But he stopped, not because of mercy, not because of morality, but because at the mouth of the alley, he heard Maggie calling, "Sawyer, are you all right?" Her voice was worried, warm, and completely convinced that her son was a brave accountant doing the right thing. He let go. He picked up the purse. He stepped out of the alley, his shirt dusty, his knee lightly scraped, and returned the purse to the girl crying on the sidewalk. The girl thanked him 3 times. Maggie sat in the car, her eyes wet, wearing the widest smile Sawyer had seen in 5 years. "My son is so wonderful," she said, her voice so full of pride that Sawyer had to turn his face away. He got back into the car. Bennett looked at him through the rearview mirror. Bennett's face had gone pale. He had just watched his boss nearly kill a petty street thief in broad daylight with his bare hands, in front of his mother, while pretending to be an accountant. Bennett said nothing. He swallowed and looked out the window. That afternoon, Maggie wanted to stop by St. Mary Church in Southie before going home. She said she had loved that church since the days when she was still teaching, that she came there every week. And even though Alzheimer's had erased so many things, the road to the church was still intact in her feet. After the service, the pastor came out to speak with the parishioners and mentioned that old Mrs. Whitaker at the end of the street needed someone to help repair her leaking roof after the rainstorm the week before. No one raised a hand. Maggie turned and looked at Sawyer. She said nothing. She only looked. Those eyes. Sawyer had faced gunmen, bosses, men who wanted to kill him. But no gaze on earth made it harder for him to say no than his mother's gaze at that moment. He raised his hand. Mrs. Whitaker was 83 years old, lived alone, and her roof leaked in 3 places. Sawyer had never held a hammer, never stood on a roof, never driven a nail in his life, unless it was into someone else in the figurative sense. But that afternoon, he stood on Mrs. Whitaker's roof beneath the September sun, a hammer in his hand, sweat running down his forehead, the skin of his palms blistering because he wasn't used to holding rough tools. Down below, 2 black cars were parked at both ends of the street. His men sitting inside, eyes sweeping the road, hands close to their waistbands. They were guarding their Mafia boss, while that same boss hammered nails into a roof for an 83-year-old woman. Maggie sat on Mrs. Whitaker's porch, drinking the tea the old woman had poured for her, looking up at her son on the roof while talking in a voice so gentle, warm, and peaceful that Sawyer could hear it from above. "His father used to help the neighbors like this too," she said to Mrs. Whitaker, and Sawyer's hammer paused for a beat. His father, the man whose name Maggie sometimes called him by when Alzheimer's tricked her, the man who had died when Sawyer was 17, before Sawyer stepped into a world his father would never have accepted. His father helped neighbors. Sawyer killed other people's neighbors. But that afternoon, on that roof, with his blistered hands and the sound of his mother telling stories below, the distance between those 2 men narrowed a little. Only a little, but enough for Sawyer to feel it. They left Boston early the next morning. Sawyer drove a rented SUV, not the organization's armored vehicle. Finch had arranged an older Ford Explorer that looked ordinary enough that no one in a small town would need to look twice. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around a cloth bag full of spices she had brought from home because she said the kitchen in Cedar Hollow probably had nothing left in it. Bennett sat in the back with another bodyguard named Keegan, both of them wearing flannel shirts and jeans, playing the part of accounting co-workers taking vacation time together. Bennett looked like an amateur camper. Keegan looked like an amateur camper with a gun hidden in his backpack. The trip from Boston to Cedar Hollow took about 3.5 hours along Interstate 91, cutting through New Hampshire, before turning onto smaller and smaller roads in Vermont. Maggie slept through most of the first part of the drive. When she woke, they had already left the highway and were traveling along a 2-lane road through a maple forest. The leaves were beginning to turn, gold and red, and the September sunlight slipped through the branches, scattering bright patches across the road. Maggie looked out the window and smiled. "We're close," she said, her voice so certain that Sawyer was surprised. Alzheimer's had taken so much from her, but it hadn't yet taken the road back to Cedar Hollow. The town appeared after a bend in the road. The old wooden sign by the roadside read, "Cedar Hollow, Vermont, population 2003. The painted letters peeling, the signpost leaning slightly. Sawyer slowed down, not because of traffic laws, but because he didn't know what to look at first. Main Street was a single street, less than half a mile long. On the left stood a white painted church with a wooden bell tower, a small post office with cloudy glass doors, and a general store with a sign that read, Pemberton's General Store. On the right was a diner with a green awning, a hand-painted wooden sign that said, Blythe's, and a gas station with 2 pumps that looked as if it hadn't been repainted since the 1980s. There were no traffic lights, not one. The entire town had no traffic lights. Sawyer realized this and didn't know what he was supposed to feel. He had spent his whole life in Boston, where every intersection was a calculation, every red light an opportunity or a trap. Here, there were no intersections that needed calculating. He parked in front of his grandmother's wooden house, at the end of a dirt road branching off from Main Street, about 100 meters from the nearest neighbor. The house had 2 stories, dark oak walls, a gray metal roof, and a front porch with 2 rocking chairs that someone had covered with a tarp against the rain. Sawyer's grandmother had died 10 years earlier, but the neighbors had kept watch over the house. Walt Pemberton, the owner of the general store, had changed the locks twice, swept the leaves every autumn, and checked the pipes every winter. He did it not because anyone asked him to, but because in Cedar Hollow, that was how people lived. Sawyer stepped out of the car. He stood on the dirt road, drew in a breath, and realized he was breathing in something he didn't have a word for. There was no smell of concrete, no smell of gasoline, no smell of gunpowder, no smell of fear. That scent he had grown so used to, he no longer noticed it existed until it was gone. The air here smelled of damp earth, fallen leaves, and dry wood. He stood there a few more seconds, breathed in once more, then opened the trunk to take out the luggage. A pickup truck drove past, and the driver waved. Sawyer watched it go and didn't wave back. In his world, a stranger waving from a moving car meant one of 2 things, a trap or a signal to someone else. Here, it only meant good morning. Bennett stood beside him, also watching the pickup truck, his hand moving by reflex toward his hip, where his gun would usually be, though today there was only a belt bag holding his phone. He looked at Sawyer. Sawyer gave a faint shake of his head. They weren't in Boston anymore. Maggie didn't wait for anyone to unload the luggage. She went straight into the house. Sawyer heard the door open, heard footsteps on the wooden floor, and then silence. He followed her inside. Maggie was standing in the middle of the living room, her right hand resting on the wall, her left hand touching the old wooden table covered in a thin layer of dust. She moved slowly through each corner of the room, touching everything: the red brick fireplace, the pine bookshelf, the coat hook behind the door where Sawyer's grandfather used to hang his scarf. Then she went into the kitchen. She touched the counter, opened the cabinets, looked inside even though they were empty, and placed her hand on the edge of the sink. She stood there for a while. Sawyer stood in the kitchen doorway, watching his mother. He said nothing. He was afraid that if he said anything at all, this moment would break. Then Maggie turned back to look at him. "It's still the same," she said. Her voice was soft, warm, and happy. Happy in a way Sawyer hadn't heard from her since Alzheimer's began. Not the confused happiness when she mistook someone's name and was gently corrected. Not the polite happiness when she didn't remember where she was but didn't want anyone to worry. This was real happiness. Happiness because she was standing in a place her body remembered, even when her mind could not. She touched the edge of the sink again, nodded, and said, "I'm going to cook dinner tonight. Go buy groceries for me at Pemberton's, will you?" And for the first time in a very long time, Sawyer Corsetti, the boss of the East Coast criminal empire, received an order he truly wanted to obey. The next morning, Sawyer walked out to Main Street to buy coffee. Maggie was still asleep, the deepest sleep she had had in months. Perhaps because of the air, perhaps because of the house, perhaps because her body recognized this place before her memory had time to confirm it. Bennett and Keegan stayed behind to guard the house, sitting on the porch drinking instant coffee and pretending to read books like 2 accountants on vacation, even though neither of them had ever finished a book in his life. Blythe's was the 3rd building on the right side of Main Street, with a green awning, a wooden screen door that creaked when it opened, 8 tables inside, a long oak counter, and the smell of hot butter mixed with freshly brewed coffee. Sawyer stepped in and sat at the table by the window, the position he always chose out of habit, back against the wall, eyes on the door, the whole room within view. He didn't choose the seat because it was comfortable. He chose it because of instinct. The waitress came out from behind the counter. Lorelei Ashford, 27 years old, brown hair tied high in a ponytail, a white apron stained with flour, thin in a way that didn't come from choosing to eat less but from not having enough money to eat more. Her face was tired, the kind of tired that had become a background, no longer a temporary state, but a condition of living. But her eyes weren't tired. Her eyes were sharp, quick, and already working from the very second she saw Sawyer. She placed the menu on the table, poured coffee into a white ceramic mug without asking whether he wanted any, because at Blythe's, everyone who sat down got coffee first. "The menu's here," she said, her voice just polite enough, neither warm nor cold. Then she turned away. But in the 3 seconds she stood beside the table, she had seen everything. The watch on Sawyer's left wrist, a Patek Philippe, white face, leather strap, the kind she didn't know by name but knew by price. Because 3 years earlier, when her grandmother June was in the hospital, she had gone online and researched the value of everything that could possibly be sold, and she had looked at enough luxury watches to know that the one on this man's wrist was not the kind any accountant on earth could wear. Then the shoes. Italian leather shoes, hand-stitched, carrying mud from the roads of Cedar Hollow, but clearly not bought in this town or in any town within 100 miles. She said nothing. She poured the coffee, turned away, and kept what she had seen to herself. Lorelei had learned to read people very early, not from books, but from necessity. Her father died when she was little, and her mother left when she was 14, leaving her with her grandmother, June Ashford, an old woman who lived on a pension and the vegetable garden behind the house. June raised her with everything she had, taught her how to cook, how to grow flowers, and most importantly, how to look. "Look at people's hands, not their mouths," June often said. "Mouths are very good at lying. Hands aren't." June died 3 years earlier, when Lorelei was 24. Cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to death. Hospital bills, medicine, funeral costs, $12,000 in all. Half of it borrowed from a local loan shark named Harlan, a man who parked his car in front of Blythe's at the beginning of every month and waited for Lorelei to come out so he could remind her that the interest was still running. She paid $200 every month, nearly 1/3 of her waitress wages, and the principal barely went down at all because the interest rate Harlan charged didn't belong inside any law a federal court would recognize. But in Cedar Hollow, no one sued Harlan, and Lorelei didn't have enough money to hire a lawyer. She lived alone in the house June had left behind, sold flowers at the weekend market for extra income, and every day she came to Blythe's from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, poured coffee, carried plates, and read every customer who walked through the door the way she read the weather, quickly, accurately, and without needing anyone to confirm it. So when Maggie Corsetti walked into the diner 15 minutes after Sawyer, sat down beside her son, and told Lorelei in the happiest voice in the world, "Honey, this is my son. He's an accountant in Boston. His salary's very low, but he's kind." Lorelei didn't need another clue. She looked at the watch on Sawyer's wrist. She looked at Maggie's eyes, the soft, clouded eyes of someone living in her own version of the world, and she understood. She didn't know who Sawyer was. She didn't know what he did, but she knew for certain that he was not an accountant, and that this old woman either didn't know that, didn't remember that, or both. She also knew one more thing, something her grandmother June had taught her to recognize very early. This man had money. And Lorelei Ashford, 27 years old, $12,000 in debt, with no family, no way out, was looking at something she had learned to recognize over 11 years of raising herself. Opportunity. Not fraud. Lorelei didn't commit fraud, but she knew how to make herself valuable in front of someone who had the ability to pay, and right now, that opportunity had taken the shape of an old woman with Alzheimer's, who liked fresh vegetables that Pemberton's general store didn't sell in enough variety. That afternoon, Lorelei knocked on the door of the wooden house. She carried a paper bag filled with greens from her garden, lettuce, tomatoes, basil, and a small jar of strawberry jam made from the recipe June had left behind. "For Mrs. Maggie," she said when Sawyer opened the door, smiling just enough. Maggie came out of the kitchen, looked at the bag of vegetables, then looked at Lorelei, and her eyes lit up. "You're so good. Come in and have tea. Come in." Sawyer stood at the door, watching Lorelei step into his house. He didn't know why she had come. He didn't know what she wanted. But he knew one thing. She had looked at his watch that morning for more than 2 seconds. And that was not how a person looked at a watch to tell time. Behind the counter at Blythe's, Blythe Corrigan, 55 years old, the owner of the diner, the woman who knew everything in town before it happened, was standing and watching through the window. She watched Lorelei walking toward the wooden house, a bag of vegetables in her hand, her steps faster than usual. She wiped a glass, shook her head lightly, and said to herself, just loud enough to hear, "Careful, sweetheart." On the third day in Cedar Hollow, Maggie looked out at the backyard and frowned. Weeds had swallowed almost all of the vegetable beds Sawyer's grandmother had once planted. The wooden fence leaned crookedly, and the soil was dry and cracked because no one had watered it for years. She turned to Sawyer and said, "Go ask Mr. Walt next door if he has a hoe. This garden needs to be cleared." Sawyer didn't know who Walt Pemberton was, but Maggie knew, or her body knew, because she walked straight to the house next door, knocked, and greeted Mr. Walt as if she still saw him every week, even though she hadn't been to Cedar Hollow in more than 5 years. Walt Pemberton was 68 years old, the owner of Pemberton's General Store, an amateur carpenter, and the kind of man who had gone extinct in big cities long ago. He didn't ask what Sawyer did for a living. He didn't ask where he came from. He didn't ask why a man of 37 didn't know how to hold a hoe. He simply handed Sawyer a hoe, pointed at the bed of soil, and said, "Hold the hoe at a 45-degree angle. Don't chop straight down, or you'll break the handle." Then he began working beside him, slowly, steadily, without explaining anything else, letting Sawyer watch and learn on his own. Sawyer Corsetti, the man who commanded more than 200 subordinates, the man whose single nod could decide who lived and who died, was standing in the middle of a vegetable garden in Vermont, sweat dripping, holding the hoe the wrong way, striking the ground with a heavy thud instead of the clean scraping sound Walt's hoe made. He did it wrong. He tried again. Wrong again. Walt didn't correct him. He simply kept hoeing beside him, letting the rhythm of his own movements serve as the lesson. After about an hour, Sawyer began to find the rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but the soil started to loosen. Walt stopped, drank some water, looked at the bed Sawyer had just worked, and gave one nod. "The soil doesn't care who you are," he said, his voice as ordinary as if he were talking about the weather. "It only cares whether you're willing to bend down." Sawyer didn't answer. He bent down and kept hoeing. That afternoon, Walt taught him how to plant tomatoes, how to dig a hole to the right depth, how to place the seedling at a slant so the roots would grip better, how to water at the base instead of watering the leaves. Bennett stood on the back porch, watching his boss kneel in the dirt, his hands muddy, trying to fit a young tomato plant into a hole without snapping the stem. He turned away so no one would see his face, because he didn't know what expression could possibly fit this scene. That evening, Maggie cooked. She stood in the kitchen of the wooden house, the kitchen whose walls and sink she had touched on the first day they arrived, and she made beef stew. Alzheimer's is a strange disease. It erases recent memories, the things that happened last week, yesterday, 10 minutes ago, but it keeps distant memories, the things buried deep in bone, in muscle, in the hands. Maggie didn't remember what day it was, but she remembered the beef stew recipe her mother had taught her 40 years earlier. She remembered the amount of salt measured by 3 fingertips, the stewing time judged by listening to the simmer, and the way to cut potatoes into cubes, just large enough not to fall apart when cooked for a long time. She cooked while telling stories, not to anyone in particular, just telling them, as if memory were spilling out along with the steam from the pot. She talked about Sawyer's father, about the day he proposed to her with a ring bought with half a month's wages from the lumber mill. The ring was terribly ugly, she said, laughing, thin as could be, and after 3 months it turned black. But he got down on one knee in the middle of the diner, in front of a dozen people, his face red as a tomato, his hand shaking like mad, and said, "Maggie, I'm not rich, but I won't let you eat a meal alone for a single day." I said yes right away. Sawyer sat at the kitchen table and listened. He had never heard this story. He knew his father had died when he was 17. He knew his father had been a worker, had earned little, and often coughed in the winter. But he didn't know how his father had proposed to his mother. He didn't know how ugly the ring had been. He didn't know his father had once said, "I won't let you eat a meal alone for a single day." Sitting there in the kitchen of the wooden house in Vermont, he realized he knew nothing about his mother. He knew she had Alzheimer's. He knew she liked to cook. He knew she went to the fake company every Tuesday. But he didn't know who she was. He didn't know how she had loved his father. He didn't know how she had lived for 15 years after losing her husband. He didn't know what she feared, what she dreamed of. or what she remembered on the nights when Alzheimer's allowed her to sleep in peace. He had spent 15 years building an empire and 5 years building a fake company to protect her, but he had never sat down and listened to her tell stories. Today was the first time. The beef stew was ready at 6 in the evening, and somehow, the dinner table that night did not hold only Sawyer, Maggie, Bennett, and Keegan. Walt Pemberton came, bringing a loaf of homemade bread. Blythe Corrigan came, bringing a bottle of apple cider. Lorelei came, bringing a plate of salad made from vegetables from her own garden. A few other neighbors stopped by too, one bringing cheese, another bringing pie. No one formally invited, yet everyone came, because in Cedar Hollow, when someone cooked in the wooden house at the end of the dirt road, that was a signal, and people came without needing an invitation. They sat around the old wooden table where Sawyer's grandmother had once sat. Maggie sat at the head of the table, ladling beef stew for each person, remembering Walt's name, remembering Blythe's name, calling Lorelei the young lady who brought the vegetables, and smiling. No one locked the door when they came in. No one looked around when they sat down. No one calculated who was sitting where, who had their back to the door, who could draw a knife fastest. Sawyer sat in the middle of the table. He looked around. He looked at his mother laughing. He looked at Walt breaking bread and sharing it with Blythe. He looked at Lorelei pouring water for Maggie, gently, naturally, as if she had been sitting at this table all her life. He looked at Bennett eating beef stew, silent, with no killer's face, no subordinate's face, only the face of a young man eating dinner in a wooden house among strangers who were not afraid of him. Sawyer felt something. He didn't know what it was. He didn't have the vocabulary for it, because 2 decades in the underworld had taught him no words for this feeling. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't safety, because he had never truly been safe. It was something he could only describe by its absence. There was no one in this room who wanted to kill him. The 4th day in Cedar Hollow was market day. Every Saturday, the open patch of ground beside the white church turned into a farmer's market, with more than 20 stalls set up beneath canvas awnings, selling vegetables, fruit, honey, baked goods, handmade soap, and flowers. Lorelei had a small stall in the far corner, selling flowers cut from her own garden, daisies, lavender, sunflowers, wrapped in old newspaper, each bouquet $3. She had been selling flowers since June was still alive, at first to earn extra money for medicine, and after June died, to earn extra money to pay Harlan. That morning, Maggie announced that she wanted to go to the market. Sawyer took her, and somehow, in a way he didn't entirely understand, he ended the morning standing behind Lorelei's stall, carrying flower pots from her old pickup truck to the display table, while Maggie wandered around the market tasting cheese and telling everyone their honey was delicious. Bennett and Keegan stood 2 stalls away, pretending to choose pumpkins, their eyes sweeping over the crowd. Sawyer carried pots. That was all he did. From the truck to the table, from the table back to the truck, from the truck to the table, following Lorelei's instructions. But while carrying those pots, he stood among the crowd. And for the first time in his life, no one looked at him with fear. No one lowered their head. No one avoided his eyes. An old woman asked him the price of a bouquet of daisies, then told him about her newborn granddaughter. An old man patted his shoulder and said, "You're strong, aren't you? Good of you to help her carry things." A child slammed straight into his leg and laughed, and Sawyer didn't know how to react, because in the past 15 years, no one had ever run into him and lived long enough to laugh afterward. Lorelei watched him all morning, quietly, continuously. She tested him in ways he didn't realize he was being tested. First, she asked him to fix the faucet behind the stall, the plastic faucet attached to the garden hose that was leaking. Sawyer looked at the faucet as if he were looking at a differential equation. He twisted it the wrong way. Water sprayed into his face, and Lorelei had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. He didn't know how to fix plumbing. An accountant might not know how to fix plumbing, but the way he didn't know, the way he looked at the faucet with complete confusion, told her this man didn't merely lack plumbing skills. He didn't know how to do anything that belonged to ordinary life. Then she asked him to sell flowers for her while she went to get more stock. 10 minutes. A middle-aged woman asked to buy a bouquet of lavender. Sawyer said $15. The real price was $3. The middle-aged woman looked at him, looked at the bouquet, then walked away. When Lorelei returned, Sawyer told her she was selling too cheaply and should raise the price. Lorelei looked at him for 3 seconds, then said, "Are you trying to sell flowers or real estate?" She laughed. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved, and Lorelei realized that might be the closest version of a smile this man had. But there was one thing she didn't need to test to recognize. Every time Sawyer entered a new space, any space at all, a stall, the checkout counter, a public restroom, his eyes swept the entire room in the first 2 seconds. Exits, entrances, the nearest person, objects that could be used as weapons. She knew that look, not because she had ever lived in the underworld, but because she had lived long enough with fear to recognize another person who was living with it too. Accountants didn't scan rooms with their eyes. That night, Lorelei closed Blythe's at 9 o'clock. She was locking the back door when she heard a car pull into the gravel lot. Harlan, 45 years old, cheap suit, a smile like machine oil. He stepped out of the car, walked toward her, and said, "It's the beginning of the month, sweetheart." Lorelei tightened her grip around the keys in her hand. She wasn't afraid of Harlan in the sense of fearing death. She was afraid of him in the sense of fearing a trap she knew she had fallen into but couldn't find a way out of. She opened her mouth to say something, then realized someone was standing at the corner of the building. Sawyer. He was walking past from the direction of the wooden house, perhaps because he couldn't sleep, perhaps because he was only taking a walk. She didn't know, but he had stopped. He said nothing. He didn't step closer. He only stood there, about 10 paces from Harlan, his hands loose at his sides, and watched. Harlan turned around. He looked at Sawyer, and in those 2 seconds, Lorelei saw something happen on Harlan's face that she had never seen before. Harlan was afraid. Not afraid because Sawyer was larger, or had more people with him. Afraid because Sawyer's eyes, in the darkness, under the dim yellow light behind Blythe's, held no anger, no threat, no warning. They were empty, completely empty, and that emptiness was more frightening than any threat Harlan had ever heard. Harlan took a step back. He said, "Next month is fine." Then he got into his car and drove away, faster than he had arrived. Lorelei stood in the gravel lot, watching Harlan's taillights disappear at the end of the road. Then she looked at Sawyer. "What do you do that makes people so afraid of you?" she asked. "I don't do anything," he said. "That's the scariest part," she said. He didn't answer. He looked at her for one more second, then turned and walked back toward the wooden house. Lorelei stood there for a while longer. She wasn't afraid of him. She should have been afraid, but she wasn't. And she didn't know whether that was more dangerous or less dangerous than being afraid. The next day, Lorelei helped Sawyer do laundry at the laundromat at the end of Main Street, the only one in town. 2 washing machines, 1 dryer, 25-cent coins. Sawyer didn't know how to use a washing machine. He stood staring at the row of buttons with the same expression she had seen when he looked at the faucet. She showed him how to sort clothes, how to pour in detergent, how to choose a cycle. While they waited for the machine to run, she sat on a plastic chair reading an old magazine, and he leaned against the wall, looking out the window. When the washing machine finished, she helped him take the clothes out, and from the pocket of his jacket, a business card fell. She picked it up. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper, with embossed lettering. Corsetti Holdings. Sawyer Corsetti, CEO. She looked at the business card. She looked at Sawyer. He was on the other side of the laundromat and hadn't seen. She slipped the business card into the pocket of her apron. She didn't ask. She didn't speak. She only kept it and began fitting the pieces together. The Patek Philippe watch, the Italian leather shoes, the eyes that scanned every room, Harlan running away, and now, CEO, Grandmother June had taught her to look at hands, not mouths. And Sawyer Corsetti's hands, from the very first day he walked into Blythe's, had never told the same story as his mouth. The 6th day, the second to last day. The wooden fence in front of the house had been leaning for too long, and Walt said that if it wasn't repaired before winter, the snow would break it completely. Sawyer didn't need anyone to ask him. That morning, he stepped out onto the porch, looked at the fence, then went over to Walt's house to get tools. He didn't knock. He walked straight into the workshop behind Walt's house and took a hammer, nails, and a handsaw, as if he had done this many times before. He hadn't done it even once. But 5 days in Cedar Hollow had taught him that here, when something needed doing, people didn't wait for permission. Walt came out to the workshop, saw that Sawyer had already taken the tools, and said nothing, only picked up a few replacement boards and followed him. They worked together all morning. They didn't talk much. Walt sawed. Sawyer held. Sawyer hammered. Walt adjusted. The rhythm of work between the two men had found a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Like the rhythm of hoeing soil on the first day, only now it was smoother, more natural, as if Sawyer's hands had begun to remember a new language. Maggie sat on the porch, in the rocking chair someone had uncovered on the first day they arrived. She drank tea, watched her son work, and from time to time called out, "Careful with your hand, sweetheart." Whenever Sawyer swung the hammer a little too hard, around 10 o'clock, Lorelei came by. She didn't give a reason. She simply brought a pot of hot tea and 4 cups, set them on the porch table beside Maggie, then sat down on the wooden steps, her legs stretched out, her face turned toward the garden, her back resting against the porch post. Vermont afternoon sunlight in September had a particular golden color. Not harsh, not hot, just warm enough to make everything it touched look softer. The light fell across Maggie's hair, across Walt's shoulders, across Lorelei's arm, across the fence, slowly becoming straight again. Maggie watched Sawyer drive a new post into the ground, watched his hand holding the hammer, then said, her voice soft, as if she were speaking only to herself, "Your father used to fix this fence too." Sawyer stopped. The hammer hung in the air for a beat. He looked down from where he was kneeling beside the fence post. He looked at his mother on the porch, her hands wrapped around the teacup, her eyes somewhere between the present and 40 years ago. He looked at Lorelei on the steps, sunlight in her hair, watching him before turning her face away when their eyes met. He looked at Walt beside him, the old man's back bent over the board he was sawing, patient, quiet, asking for nothing. He looked down at the hand holding the hammer, the same hand that had signed death orders, the same hand that had folded 11 little notes saying "Mom loves you" and tucked them into his wallet, the same hand that had nearly broken the thief's neck in Boston, the same hand that was now driving a fence post into the ground in Cedar Hollow under September sunlight, in front of his mother. He said nothing. He kept hammering. The rhythm of the hammer was slower than before. In the back corner of the yard, Bennett was watering the plants. No one had told him to water them. No one had given him the job. He had gone to get the hose by himself, turned on the water by himself, and stood there watering the tomato beds Sawyer had planted with Walt days earlier. He watered slowly, evenly, his eyes on the stream of water, though his mind was somewhere else. At some point, he stopped. He looked up toward the front porch. He looked at Maggie in the rocking chair, Lorelei on the steps, Walt and Sawyer by the fence, the afternoon sun. He looked for a long time. Then he turned back to water the plants, but his hand moved more slowly, and his face, the face that for 10 years had shown nothing but cold calculation, now carried an expression that no one who saw it would know how to name. They ate dinner together for the last time in Cedar Hollow that night. Maggie made beef stew again, saying that because the last one had turned out so well, she had to make it again so her hands would remember. Lorelei stayed later than everyone else, washing dishes in the kitchen after Maggie had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, her hand still holding the old photo album she had found on the bookshelf that afternoon. Sawyer stood outside on the porch. Cedar Hollow nights were thick with darkness, with no streetlights, only stars and the sound of crickets. He was standing there when his phone vibrated. Finch. He looked at the screen, then answered. "Greer says Kane is asking about your schedule," Finch said, his voice low and quick. "Specific questions. Where you went, who you went with, how long you'll be gone. Someone told Kane you left Boston." Silence. The sound of crickets in the garden. The sound of water running in the kitchen where Lorelei was washing dishes. Sawyer turned and looked through the window. Inside, yellow light. Maggie lay on the sofa, her face more peaceful than he had seen it in 5 years, the photo album resting on her chest, rising and falling with her breath. Lorelei stood at the sink, her hands in soap water, the light casting her shadow onto the kitchen wall, small, slender, still. He looked at that scene for 10 seconds, counted them clearly in his head. 10 seconds. Then he stepped down from the porch and walked into the yard, away from the window, away from where anyone could hear. He stopped at the maple tree at the far end of the garden, where the darkness swallowed all the house light. "Find out who," he said into the phone. "Handle it." 2 words. The same 2 words he had said to Finch in the Boston basement when he ordered the trip approved. But this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the voice of the man driving fence posts under the afternoon sun. It wasn't the voice of the man eating beef stew with his mother in the wooden kitchen. This was another voice, the voice that, for 2 decades, had made people call him boss, cold, flat, leaving no room for anything except command. In the kitchen, Lorelei was washing the last pot. She looked out the garden window. She saw Sawyer standing under the maple tree. The phone pressed to his ear. His back turned toward the house. She couldn't hear anything. But she saw. She saw his shoulders straighten in a way they never did when he was inside with Maggie. She saw his head tilt to the left, the angle of a man giving orders, not listening to them. She saw his left hand close at his side, not into a fist, but into control, the grip of a man holding himself back from doing something instinct demanded. She saw his body, the body that had learned to carry flower pots, had learned to hold a hoe, had learned to drive fence posts, turn in 3 seconds into something else entirely, something Cedar Hollow had no name for. Lorelei set the pot down. She dried her hands with a towel. She looked out the window one more time. Then she turned back, kept washing the dishes, and asked nothing when Sawyer walked into the house 10 minutes later with the face of the man who had repaired the fence, as if the man beneath the maple tree had never existed. They left Cedar Hollow on Sunday morning. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her hands wrapped around the jar of strawberry jam Lorelei had given her before they left, saying she would eat it every morning with toast. Sawyer drove, eyes on the road, but his mind was still on that wooden porch, on the newly repaired fence, on the maple tree where he had stood making the phone call the night before. Lorelei stood in front of Blythe's and watched the Ford Explorer disappear at the end of Main Street. She didn't wave. She only stood there, holding a tablecloth, watching until she could no longer see the dust on the road. In the pocket of her apron, she still had the business card. Corsetti Holdings, CEO. She hadn't decided what she would do with it yet. 3.5 hours later, the car parked in the basement of the Corsetti Holdings building in Boston. Sawyer stepped out of the car, and the world changed back in the distance between the car door and the elevator door. The smell of concrete, fluorescent light. Finch was waiting with a folder 4 centimeters thick. 1 week away, and a folder 4 centimeters thick. Finch began reporting immediately inside the elevator. Kane had expanded operations in Portland while Sawyer was gone. 2 shipments had been delayed at the port because a distribution partner was hesitating over his loyalty. A mid-level subordinate named Novak had made a serious mistake, exposing a transport line to an investigative journalist, and according to the rules, Novak had to face the harshest consequence the organization could give. Sawyer listened. He heard everything. But when Finch placed the folder on the basement desk and said, "Novak needs to be handled before Wednesday," Sawyer didn't nod right away. He went silent. He looked at the file. Then he said, "Does Novak have a family?" Finch stopped. In 15 years, Sawyer had never asked that question before making a decision. The organization's rules didn't take family into account. The rules took mistakes and consequences into account. Period. "A wife and a daughter," Finch said slowly. "The daughter is 4 years old." Sawyer looked at the file for another 10 seconds. "Transfer Novak to Portland," he said. "Demote him. Cut off all access to the main line. If he makes another mistake, there won't be a third chance." Finch said nothing. He wrote down the order. But his hand moved more slowly than usual, because he was registering something he had never had to register before. Sawyer had just spared a man who was supposed to die. It wasn't the only time. In the first week after returning, Sawyer postponed a hit on a rival in Dorchester that he had approved before the trip, saying they needed more information, even though Finch knew the information had been complete for a long time. He reduced the punishment for 2 other subordinates who had violated territorial rules. He let go of a small debt that he would once have collected down to the last cent. Finch saw all of it. Finch said nothing to Sawyer, because Finch knew the boundaries. But the subordinates didn't know the boundaries. They whispered. In the basement, in the parking garage, in encrypted calls they thought no one was hearing. The boss had gone soft. The boss was different now. The boss had gone somewhere for a week and come back another man. And in this world, a boss going soft wasn't good news. A boss going soft was an opening. An opening was an opportunity, and there was exactly one man inside the organization who had been looking for that opening for 2 years. Greer Whitfield, 38 years old, had joined the Corsetti organization 3 years earlier, with a clean record and excellent logistics skills. He had risen quickly, and Finch had assigned him to oversee transport logistics in New England, a position high enough to know every movement of the organization, but low enough that no one examined him too closely. Greer wasn't Corsetti's man. Greer was Everett Kane's man, planted there 2 years earlier with one mission only: find Sawyer's weakness. For 2 years, Greer had found nothing. Sawyer had no girlfriend, no vice, no personal asset that was easy to target, nothing outside the organization that anyone could use as leverage. Until last week. Greer had followed Sawyer to Cedar Hollow. He didn't enter the town. He parked at the gas station outside it, used binoculars, and took photographs. Photographs of Sawyer driving fence posts. Photographs of Maggie sitting on the porch. Photographs of Lorelei bringing tea. Photographs of Bennett watering plants in the garden. Photographs of the wooden house at the end of the dirt road. He sent them all to Kane through an encrypted channel, along with one note: his mother, Alzheimer's, visits every Tuesday. No heavy security. This is the weakness. Everett Kane, 50 years old, sat in his office in Providence, Rhode Island, and opened each photograph on his tablet. He looked at Maggie on the porch, looked at Sawyer holding a hammer, looked at the wooden house in the middle of open land, and he smiled. For the first time in 6 months, since Sawyer had blocked all 3 of his distribution routes in Maine, Kane smiled. Not a happy smile. The smile of a man who had just found the key he had been searching for across 2 years. In Boston, Sawyer knew nothing about Greer, nothing about the photographs, nothing about Kane's smile. He only knew that on Tuesday morning that week, Maggie called with 30 minutes' notice, as always, and Finch activated Mother Protocol, as always, and 15 men took their positions within 22 minutes, as always. Maggie stepped onto the 4th floor. She carried the lunchbox wrapped in a cloth towel. She placed it on Sawyer's desk. But today, she didn't walk around asking after the co-workers. She didn't ask whether Dave had gotten over his cold. She didn't pat Bennett on the shoulder. She sat down in the chair beside Sawyer's desk, quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes on her son. Sawyer opened the lunchbox. Beef stew. He picked up the plastic fork, but she kept looking at him, saying nothing, and her silence was heavier than any question. Then she spoke, her voice soft and slow. In Cedar Hollow, you smile differently. I noticed. Sawyer stopped with the fork hanging in midair. He looked at his mother. Her eyes, he didn't know whether those were lucid eyes or clouded eyes, didn't know whether she was speaking from a moment of clarity or from some region of memory Alzheimer's had not yet touched. She looked at him for a few more seconds. Then she blinked, looked down at the lunchbox, and asked, "Oh, what did I bring you today?" She forgot. Or she chose not to say more. Sawyer didn't know, and because he didn't know, that sentence, in Cedar Hollow, you smile differently, did not fall to the ground like the words Alzheimer's swallowed back after 5 minutes. That sentence remained suspended, on the 4th floor of the fake company, in the air between mother and son. In Sawyer's mind for the entire week after that, every time he sat in the basement, beneath the fluorescent lights, and tried to remember the last time he had smiled in Boston. The following Tuesday, 10 o'clock in the morning, Maggie called Sawyer, not to say she was coming to the company, but to say she wanted to stop by the flower market in Beacon Hill first, because she had seen beautiful daisies there the week before, and wanted to buy a bouquet for the dining table. Sawyer said that was fine, she should go, Wallace would drive her. She told him she had cooked lunch for him the night before, that the lunchbox was in the refrigerator, and that he should remember to take it to work. Then she hung up. That was the last call. Wallace Briggs drove Maggie to the flower market at 10:15. He parked in the gravel lot beside the market, opened the door for her, then leaned against the car and waited, his eyes sweeping the street out of habit. Maggie walked into the market, purse in hand, her steps slow but happy, looking for the daisy stall. Wallace watched her disappear behind the row of booths, then turned back to look at the road. He saw the white truck parked at the head of the gravel lot. He didn't see the black van parked at the far end. He didn't see it because he was looking in the wrong direction. Everything happened in less than 90 seconds. The black van entered the gravel lot from behind, blocking Wallace's way out. At the same time, the white truck started moving, blocking the front. Wallace recognized it at once, his hand reaching down to the passenger seat where he had hidden the gun, but the driver's side door had already been yanked open from outside. 2 men in black masks sprayed anesthetic gas straight into his face. Wallace struggled, landed a punch on one of them, but a second spray came from the other side. He collapsed onto the steering wheel in 7 seconds. They didn't kill him. That was intentional. Kane wanted to leave a living witness, because a living witness could carry the news back. Inside the flower market, Maggie was holding up a bouquet of daisies when a polite man stepped up beside her, smiled, and said, "Mrs. Maggie, your son asked me to come pick you up. He's been pulled into an unexpected meeting." Maggie looked at the man. Paxton Hale, 33 years old, clean-faced, pale blue shirt, proper smile. He looked like an office worker. Maggie smiled. "Oh, he's always busy. Are you one of his co-workers?" "Yes, ma'am," Hale said, and offered his hand to support her elbow. "The car's right outside." Maggie put the bouquet of daisies down. She followed Hale through the back entrance of the market, where a black sedan was already parked, the rear door open. She got in. The door closed. The car drove away. She vanished from Boston at 10:28 in the morning, in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowd, and no one heard a scream, because there was no scream at all. She went with them because she believed her son was an accountant, and an accountant's co-workers did not kidnap an accountant's mother. 20 minutes later, Wallace woke in the car with a bruise on his face and the smell of chemicals in his nose. He looked at the passenger seat. Empty. He turned toward the gravel lot. Empty. He staggered out of the car and saw, on the back seat, a white envelope. Inside was a photograph of Maggie sitting on the 4th floor of the fake company, opening Sawyer's lunchbox for him, 15 men seated around them pretending to work. A stolen photograph, taken from outside the glass door, from a high angle, every face clear. On the back of the photograph, written by hand in black ink, in neat capital letters, "Great Accountant, Corsetti." Wallace called Finch. His hand shook so badly he had to dial 3 times. Finch answered. Finch didn't ask him to repeat it. Finch called Sawyer. Sawyer was in the basement, reading that week's transportation report, drinking black coffee, living inside the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday before his mother arrived. His phone vibrated. "Finch." Sawyer picked up. "Maggie's been taken," Finch said. 3 words. Finch's voice shook. For the first time in all those years, Sawyer heard Finch's voice shake. Finch had heard news of subordinates dying without shaking. He had heard news of losing millions of dollars without shaking. He had heard news that the FBI had opened an investigation without shaking. But the 3 words, "Maggie's been taken," made his voice shake, because Finch knew Maggie. Finch knew she had called him by his correct name in the hallway even though no one had introduced him. Finch knew she made beef stew and tucked little notes into the lunchbox. Finch knew that if anything happened to her, Sawyer Corsetti would no longer be Sawyer Corsetti, and the organization would lose far more than a hostage. The basement went silent. The 6 people present at that moment had all heard Finch over the speakerphone, and every one of them stood frozen. Sawyer sat at the desk. He set the phone down. He said nothing for 30 seconds. 30 seconds in the silent basement, beneath the fluorescent lights, where no one dared to breathe, because everyone knew that a long silence from Sawyer Corsetti was more dangerous than 30 seconds of anyone else screaming. Then Sawyer looked to the right. His mother's lunchbox was on the desk. She had cooked it the night before, as always, and left it in the refrigerator for him to take to work that morning. He had brought it. He hadn't opened it. He opened it now. Beef stew. And a small folded note, the handwriting trembling because her hand was no longer as steady as before. "Mom loves you. Remember to eat it all." He looked at the note. He folded it again. He slipped it into his wallet, together with 11 other little notes. Then he set the lunchbox down. He stood. He looked around the basement, at every face. "Call everyone in," he said. Everyone. 45 minutes after the summons, the basement of the Corsetti Holdings building held 30 people. This was not a routine meeting. This was the first time in 5 years Sawyer had called the entire command level back into the same room. They stood along both sides of the long table, silent, looking toward the head of the table where Sawyer sat. Sawyer did not stand. He sat, and the way he sat told them everything they needed to know. This was not the Sawyer who had postponed the Dorchester hit the week before. Not the Sawyer who had spared Novak. Not the Sawyer the men had been whispering had gone soft. The man sitting at the head of the table now, beneath the fluorescent lights, his eyes flat and still as frozen water, was the version who had built this organization from nothing 15 years ago. The version people called boss not because of a title, but because of fear. Kane took my mother, he said. No explanation, no description. 6 words, and the whole room understood the severity. Because no one among these 30 people had ever heard Sawyer mention his mother in the context of work. She existed in a place the organization was never allowed to touch, and Kane had just touched it. Lock down every Kane operation in Boston, Sawyer continued. 24 hours. Every distribution channel, every transaction point, every one of his people on our territory. Shut them all down. No one of Kane's moves through Boston without being watched. Find my mother. Anyone who gets in the way, handle them. He did not explain what handle them meant. He did not need to. 30 people scattered within 10 minutes. The basement was left with only Sawyer, Finch, and Bennett. Bennett's hand was still lightly bandaged from the scratch he had gotten in Cedar Hollow when he helped Walt repair the fence. The dirty white bandage looking out of place against the black suit he had just changed into. Finch stood beside the table, opened his laptop, and began doing what 20 years of experience had taught him to do. Trace backward. Not trace Kane, because Kane was too careful to leave a direct trail. Finch traced the information. Who knew Sawyer had gone to Cedar Hollow? Who knew the specific schedule? Who knew Maggie came to the company every Tuesday? The list was short, very short. Only 5 people knew the details of the Cedar Hollow schedule: Sawyer, Finch, Bennett, Keegan, and Greer Whitfield. Greer had been assigned to arrange the logistics for the trip because he was in charge of transportation operations in New England, including Vermont. He knew the departure date, the return date, the address of the wooden house, the route, and the daily movement schedule. Finch looked at the list. He looked again. Then he looked at Sawyer. Greer, he said. 1 word. Sawyer did not ask why. He trusted Finch. 20 years of trusting Finch, and Finch had never been wrong when he said a name. Call him down, Sawyer said. Bennett went upstairs to call Greer. 5 minutes later, Greer Whitfield walked into the basement, his face normal, his stride confident. He either did not know he had been exposed, or he was such a good actor that he still believed he was safe. Sawyer stood. In the back room, he said to Greer, his voice ordinary, as if inviting him into a private meeting. Greer nodded. The 2 of them stepped into the room behind the basement, the small windowless room the men called the talking room. The door closed. Bennett stood outside. Finch sat at the laptop table, eyes on the screen, ears listening. 10 minutes. No one could clearly hear anything from inside. No screaming, no banging, only Sawyer's low, even, continuous voice, and, now and then, Greer answering, each response shorter than the one before. Then the door opened. Sawyer stepped out. Alone. His right hand held Greer's cell phone. He looked at Bennett and gave a cold, barely perceptible nod toward the closed door. Take Greer to the harbor, Sawyer murmured, his voice cutting through the damp air. He stays in the dark until this is over. If my mother isn't home by sunrise, ensure he never sees another one. Bennett didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, signaled 2 men, and stepped into the room. His left hand was normal, relaxed at his side. His face showed nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Flat. He placed Greer's phone on the table in front of Finch. Every message with Kane, he said. 2 years. Everything he reported. Everything Kane asked. Finch opened the phone. The password had already been unlocked. He quickly read through the encrypted message chain. Finch swept the phone off the table and pocketed it, knowing he would need to dig deeper into its hardware during the long drive ahead. The Cedar Hollow photographs. Sawyer's schedule. Information about Maggie. Information about Mother Protocol. Information about the fake company on the 4th floor. Kane knew everything, but Finch read it all, from beginning to end, and he did not find the thing he needed most, the location where Maggie was being held. Not a single line showed where she was. No address, no coordinates, no code name, no hint. Kane was not stupid. Kane never sent location information through electronic channels, no matter how heavily encrypted. The hostage location was something only one person knew, and that person was Paxton Hale, the direct subordinate who had carried out the kidnapping, the man who had now vanished from every radar the Corsetti organization could sweep. Finch looked up. There's no location, he said. Sawyer looked at Greer's phone on the table. He looked at the 30 names on the organization's contact list. He thought about the network stretching along the East Coast, about hundreds of eyes, dozens of information channels, about an entire empire built on the ability to know everything before it happened, and nothing in that empire could tell him where his mother was. Bennett stood in the corner of the room, looking at Sawyer, looking at Finch, looking at the phone on the table. He clenched his hand into a fist, then released it. Clenched, then released. He thought of Maggie, of her voice saying hello, Aunt Maggie, every Tuesday, of dinner in Cedar Hollow, of her sitting on the porch, watching her son repair the fence, and he thought that if someone hurt her, he would find that person, and he would not need Sawyer to give the order. 11 o'clock at night. The basement was still lit. Finch was tracing every one of Kane's communication channels, every real estate asset, every warehouse, every address that had ever appeared in the organization's files. Bennett was calling every contact across New England, asking whether anyone had seen Paxton Hale, what car he was in, which direction he went, anything at all. 30 men were turning over every stone in Boston and finding nothing underneath. Sawyer stood in the corner of the room, looking at the map on the wall, looking at the markers of Kane's territory spread across New England, and he knew his mother was somewhere inside that red region, but that region covered thousands of square miles. Then he did something no one in the basement expected. He took out his personal phone, not the organization phone, the phone whose number only 3 people in the world had, and he called Lorelei. She picked up after the second ring. It was 11 o'clock at night in Cedar Hollow, and Lorelei was sitting at the kitchen table in June's house, with the business card reading Corsetti Holdings, CEO, in front of her and an old laptop open on a search page. She had been looking into Corsetti Holdings since the day Sawyer left. She had found enough to know, and not enough to understand. "Lorelei," Sawyer said. His voice was different from every other time she had heard it. Not the voice of the man carrying flower pots at the farmer's market. Not the voice of the man standing beside her in front of Harlan. This voice was bare. No mask at all. "My mother's been taken," he said. Silence. Long silence. Lorelei heard that sentence, and in the 3 seconds of quiet, she rearranged every piece she had gathered over the past week. The Patek Philippe watch, the Italian leather shoes, the eyes that scanned every room, Harlan running away, the CEO business card, Corsetti Holdings on Google, a real estate company in Boston with hundreds of millions in revenue, and old articles mentioning the Corsetti name in contexts that had nothing to do with real estate. She didn't ask, "Who are you?" She already knew he wasn't an accountant. She didn't need him to confirm it. Instead, she said, "A stranger was asking about you here, last week, after you left." Sawyer tightened his grip on the phone. "Who?" "A man, in his 30s, pale blue shirt, driving a car with Massachusetts plates. Asked Mrs. Blythe how long you were here, where you were staying, who you were with." Sawyer looked at Finch. Finch was listening and already understood. Pale blue shirt, Paxton Hale. "Anything else?" Sawyer asked. "Wait," Lorelei said. And for the next 3 hours, Lorelei Ashford, the flower-selling girl who owed $12,000 in a town of 2,000 people, did what Sawyer Corsetti's 30 armed men could not do. She investigated. Not with guns, not with a network, not with money. With the method 11 years of raising herself in a small town had taught her. Ask the right person, ask the right question, and listen. She called Blythe first. Blythe remembered the stranger. A man, brown hair, around 35, Boston accent. Asked about the accountant from the city. Ordered black coffee but didn't drink it. Just sat there looking out at the road. Blythe remembered something else. He parked behind the diner, not in front. "Everyone here parks in front." She called Walt. Walt had not seen the stranger in the diner, but he had seen an unfamiliar car parked on the trail east of town, the trail leading up the hill where someone could look down at the wooden house and the whole area around it. "Black sedan," Walt said. "Out-of-state plates. Parked there for at least 2 hours. I thought it was a hiker." She called the gas station owner, Mr. Haggerty, the only man selling gasoline within 15 miles. Haggerty remembered. "There was a guy in a blue shirt who filled the tank last week. Paid cash," Haggerty said. "But he was muttering about a secure safe house his crew maintained up north in Lancaster, New Hampshire." He was checking a map of Coos County on his phone. Lorelei immediately relayed this to Sawyer at 1:15 in the morning. The stranger was looking for a safe house in Lancaster, Coos County, New Hampshire. "This is everything I found." Sawyer received the photo at 1:15 in the morning. He looked at the receipt. He looked at Finch. Finch had already opened a map of Coos County on the laptop. That area had 17 recorded warehouses and abandoned mills, and probably twice as many that weren't recorded. But 17 was better than thousands. 17 was a number they could work with. Sawyer called Lorelei back. "Thank you," he said. A short silence. Then Lorelei said, her voice calm, clear, and steady. "Sawyer, you're not an accountant. Not a question. A statement. Exactly the way his mother would have said it if she were lucid." "No," he said. "I'm not." Another silence. "Then who are you?" "I'm the man who's going to bring his mother home," he said. "After that, I'll tell you everything, if you still want to hear it." A third silence. The longest one. Lorelei sat in the car, in the parking lot of Haggerty's gas station, at 1:20 in the morning. Cedar Hollow pitch dark around her. The phone in her hand. The toll road receipt on the passenger seat. She thought of Sawyer's eyes on the night Harlan ran away. She thought of his hand holding the hammer on old Mrs. Whitaker's roof. She thought of Maggie sitting on the porch, saying, "Your father used to help the neighbors like this too." She thought of the CEO business card in her apron pocket, and she thought of her grandmother June, who had taught her to look at hands instead of mouths, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world was not a bad person, but a good person capable of doing bad things. "Don't make me regret this," she said. Then she hung up. Finch narrowed the 17 locations down to 3 within 6 hours. He eliminated warehouses too close to residential areas, eliminated places without access roads for large vehicles, eliminated mills that had already been demolished or were under renovation projects with people coming and going. The 3 remaining locations were all deep in the forests of Coos County, from 20 to 40 minutes by car from Lancaster, and at least 5 miles from the nearest home. Sawyer sent 3 scouting teams, 2 men each, up to New Hampshire in the middle of the night. The second team reported back at 4 o'clock in the morning, an abandoned lumber warehouse off Route 2, with 2 vehicles parked behind it, a black sedan with Massachusetts plates and a white van with no plates. There was light inside. At least 3 people were moving. Sawyer left Boston at 4:15, 3 cars, 12 men, including Bennett, Finch, and 8 of the organization's best armed subordinates. The drive took 3 hours. Sawyer sat in the passenger seat of the first car and said nothing the whole way. He looked through the window, watched Interstate 93 roll backward through the darkness, the same road Paxton Hale had taken when he carried his mother away. He thought of Maggie, of the last time she had called, her voice cheerful, saying she wanted to buy daisies, of the lunchbox in the refrigerator that she had cooked the night before, of the little note saying, "Mom loves you. Remember to eat it all," tucked inside his wallet with 11 others. He did not think of Cedar Hollow. He did not think of the fence, the afternoon sun, or Lorelei's voice saying, "Don't make me regret this." He shut it all off. Shut off Cedar Hollow. Shut off the man who had driven fence posts into the ground. Shut off the man who had carried flower pots at the farmer's market. Only the version that had built an empire 15 years ago remained. The version that did not hesitate. They reached the lumber warehouse at 7:10 in the morning. The sky was still dim, the forest mist thick, the temperature near freezing. The lumber warehouse was a single-story rusted steel building, about 40 meters long. Its tin roof punctured with holes, 3 entrances, 2 main doors in front, and 1 side door in the back. The black sedan and the white van were still parked in the gravel lot behind it. The scouts reported over the radio. 4 people inside, 3 on the main floor and 1 person in the back room. No heavy weapons visible, but handguns were certain. Sawyer did not lead the charge. He was not an action hero. He was a strategist. He commanded from behind the second car, giving orders through the radio, each team, each position, each second. Bennett led the assault team, 6 men, through the front entrance. 2 others circled around to the side door in the back. Finch stayed in the car with Sawyer, holding the communication channel. Bennett counted down over the radio. 3, 2, 1. The main door was broken open with a sledgehammer. Bennett was the first to step inside. It was dark within, smelling of rotted wood and old machine oil, flashlight beams sweeping across a wide space filled with collapsed wooden racks and rusted saw machines. Shouting, running footsteps. The first gunshot came from deeper inside, from behind a row of wooden shelves, the bullet tearing through a thin plank less than a handspan from Bennett's head. Bennett dropped low, fired back, and advanced. 2 subordinates followed behind him. Kane's men on the main floor were subdued at once. with 2 shot and wounded, while Paxton Hale himself was knocked down and tied up by Bennett in less than 3 minutes. But in those 3 minutes, a bullet grazed Bennett's left shoulder. He fell sideways, his back slamming into a wooden shelf, his hand still gripping the gun, blood soaked through his jacket. He gritted his teeth, leaned against the shelf, looked toward the main door, and said through the radio, "Main floor is clear. Back room left. I need 1 minute." Sawyer did not give him 1 minute. Sawyer had left the car the moment the first gunshot rang out. He stepped through the main door, stepped over Kane's 2 men lying on the ground, walked to where Bennett was leaning against the wooden shelf, looked at the wound on his shoulder for 1 second, then took the backup gun from Bennett's hand. Bennett looked up. "Boss, let me." "Stay here," Sawyer said. 2 words. The same 2 words he used when giving an order. Bennett did not argue. Sawyer stepped past him. He moved along the lumber warehouse, the gun held low at his hip, his steps even, neither fast nor slow. He passed the first room, empty. The second room, old tables and chairs, beer cans, cigarette ash, the place where Kane's men had sat guard. The third room, a wooden door closed, locked from the outside with an iron bar across it. He pulled the iron bar free. He opened the door. The flashlight beam swept into the small room. Concrete walls, cement floor, a wooden chair in the center. Maggie sat in the chair. Her hands were tied behind her back with plastic ties. Her feet were not tied, but she could not go anywhere because the chair was bolted to the floor. She was trembling. Her whole body was trembling, but she was not crying. She sat straight, her chin slightly lifted, in the posture that 30 years of teaching in front of 30 children in the 3rd grade had taught her. Back straight, eyes forward, never let anyone see you afraid. When the door opened, she looked up. She looked at Sawyer. She looked at his face, unshaven, his eyes red from not sleeping, his jaw clenched hard. She looked at his shirt, a black shirt, not the office suit he wore every Tuesday on the 4th floor. She looked at his hand, the gun. She looked at his cuff. Blood. Not his blood. She looked from the gun up to his eyes, slowly, from steel to skin to eyes. And in those eyes, she did not see the accountant from the 4th floor. She did not see the little boy who had once fallen off his bicycle and cried on the front porch. She saw something she had suspected, something she had feared, something she had chosen not to look at for 5 years. She looked at him. He looked at her. The small room was silent. There was only the sound of their breathing, and somewhere outside, Bennett's faint groan and the low crackle of the radio. Maggie looked at him for 10 seconds. 10 seconds with no Alzheimer's slipping in between, no layer of fog covering anything, no memory drifting away. 10 seconds of complete clarity, the clearest she had been in 5 years, as if her brain had decided that this moment was too important to forget. "Sawyer," she said. Not the voice she used when asking after the fake coworkers on the 4th floor. Not the voice she used when she mistook him for his father. This was the voice of Margaret Corsetti, an elementary school teacher for 30 years, the woman who had raised her son alone after her husband died, the woman who had watched her son change day by day and had not been able to stop it. "You are not an accountant." Not a question. There was no question mark in her voice, no hesitation, no guessing. A statement, 5 words, clear, certain, and heavier than any sentence any court could ever hand down. Sawyer stood in the doorway, gun in hand, blood on his cuff, and heard his mother say those 5 words, and everything he had built over the past 5 years, the fake floor, mother protocol, the 15 men in office suits, the financial reports Preston printed every Tuesday. Every time Bennett wore round framed glasses and bowed his head to say, "Hello, Aunt Maggie," all of it collapsed in 5 words. He set the gun down on the cement floor. The sound of steel touching cement rang through the small room, cold and final. He stepped in front of his mother's chair. He knelt. Both knees touched the cold cement floor. He reached behind her back, found the plastic tie binding her hands, and cut it with the pocket knife he pulled from his pants pocket. The tie fell. Maggie's hands were free. She did not rub her wrists, even though the tie had left red marks. She did not look at the marks. She looked at her son kneeling in front of her. Sawyer held both of his mother's hands. Her hands were cold, trembling, small inside his. He looked up at her face, and he said, in a voice he had never used in front of anyone in 2 decades, a voice with no power in it, no command, no armor at all, Only himself, the son, before his mother. No, Mom, I'm not an accountant. He stopped. I'm sorry. Maggie looked at him. She looked at the 37-year-old face kneeling before her, and she saw the 5-year-old face that had once knelt in front of her on the porch after falling off his bicycle, scraping his knee, and crying. She lifted her right hand, still trembling, and placed it on his cheek. She stroked it, slowly, from his cheekbone down to his jaw, exactly the way she had done 32 years earlier when little Sawyer fell off his bicycle. Exactly the same, because her body remembered even when her memory was failing, because some things live in the hands, not in the head. I know, she said. Sawyer stopped breathing. I've known for a long time. She spoke slowly, word by word, as if each word were a stone she was setting down after carrying it on her back for far too long. I've known for a long time, sweetheart. I can't remember many things anymore. I forget street names. I forget what day it is. I forget what I'm cooking. But I don't forget you. I don't forget my son. And I know you are not an accountant. She paused. Her hand was still on his cheek. I know that 4th floor is fake. I know Bennett isn't your coworker. I know the papers on your desk aren't real reports. I know. Since when? Sawyer asked, his voice hoarse. I don't remember exactly. Sometimes I know. Sometimes I forget that I know. But every time I'm lucid, I know again. Then I forget. Then I know again. It keeps repeating. She looked at him. But I didn't say anything, because every Tuesday, you sit and eat lunch with me. You hold that plastic fork. You listen to me talk about the neighbor's cat. You fold the little note I write and put it in your wallet. Tears ran down Sawyer's face. He did not wipe them away. He did not move. He only knelt there and let the tears fall, for the first time in 2 decades. Because the last time he had cried was the day his father died, and after that day he had sworn to himself that nothing in this world would ever have enough power to make him cry again. He had been wrong. I only wanted to eat lunch with you, Maggie said. I don't care what you do. I don't care whether that 4th floor is real or fake. I care that every Tuesday, you sit with me. That is real. That part is real. Sawyer understood. In that moment, kneeling on the cold cement floor inside an abandoned lumber warehouse in Coos County, New Hampshire, he understood. He had been acting for his mother for 5 years, building a fake company, renting a whole floor, making 15 subordinates wear suits, printing fake reports, all so his mother would not know the truth. And his mother, the woman he thought Alzheimer's had taken everything from, had been acting for him for 5 years. She knew, and she chose not to say it, because if she said it, Tuesday lunch would be gone. Her son would no longer sit there eating beef stew with a plastic fork and listening to her stories. The 4th floor would disappear, and she would lose the one thing Alzheimer's had not yet taken from her. 1 hour a week with her son. They had both been acting for each other. Each one knew. Each one chose not to break it. Because Tuesday lunch was real. The plastic fork was real. The little note saying, "Mom loves you," was real. And every Tuesday was real, even though everything around it, the desk, the computer, the suit, the round-framed glasses, the fake name, was false. Maggie held his hand, held it tight. Her hand was no longer trembling. "Take me home," she said. Not a request, not a plea, an order. The voice of an elementary school teacher of 30 years. The voice no child would dare disobey. The voice that Sawyer Corsetti, boss of the East Coast criminal empire, could never say no to. "Yes, Mom," he said. "I'll take you home." Sawyer rose from the cement floor. He wiped his face with the back of his hand once, only once, then turned to look toward the doorway, where Finch was waiting. Finch did not step inside. He had been standing outside the door long enough to hear everything, and on the face of the 42-year-old man who never showed emotion, there was something he quickly erased before Sawyer could see it. "Kane," Sawyer said. "One word." Finch nodded. "I extracted all the data from Greer's phone onto a USB on the way up here, not just the messages. There's also the financial transaction history Greer handled for Kane through our system. 3 federal bank accounts Kane used for money laundering, with digital fingerprints, timestamps, and real names," Finch added. "Enough for the FBI to open a grand jury investigation within 24 hours. Sawyer looked at the USB in Finch's hand. Small, black, lighter than a bullet, but its destructive power was greater than any gun in this warehouse. "Where is Kane?" Sawyer asked. Providence, waiting for word from Hale. Finch looked at the 3 Kane men tied up on the main floor. Hale won't be able to report back. Kane will know something is wrong within a few hours. Good, Sawyer said. Call the intermediary line. Tell Kane I want to meet. Not in person. A call. In 10 minutes. Finch made the call. The intermediary was a lawyer in Hartford whom both sides used when they needed to speak without meeting face to face. The lawyer called Kane. Kane picked up. 10 minutes later, Sawyer stood outside the lumber warehouse, the morning already bright, the mist thinning, the phone pressed to his ear, speaking to Everett Kane for the first time in 2 years. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not describe what he would do to Kane. His voice was calm, slow, every word clear, the voice of a man reading out a sentence, not negotiating one. I have a USB containing every money laundering transaction you ran through 3 federal bank accounts, Sawyer said. Real names, real account numbers, timestamps, digital fingerprints, enough for the FBI to close the file without needing one more day of investigation. You choose, the FBI or me. One of us ends you tonight. Silence on the other end. Sawyer heard Kane breathing, heavy, slow, the breathing of a 50-year-old man realizing that the game had just turned over and there was no move left to save it. If I return her, Kane began. She's sitting beside me, Sawyer said. You're too late to return her. A longer silence. Then the call ended. Kane said nothing more. There was no need to say more. Within 2 hours after the call, Finch's intelligence network confirmed it. Kane had left Providence in his private car, heading north, following Interstate 91 toward the Canadian border. He chose to run. Sawyer let him run, not because of mercy, not because of exhaustion, but because Finch had made another phone call before Sawyer spoke to Kane, a call to a contact Finch had kept for 20 years in case of emergency, an FBI agent at the Burlington, Vermont office, a man with whom Finch had long held an unspoken arrangement. I give you the big fish, you don't look my way. The USB was sent by special courier to the Burlington FBI office before Kane could reach the border. The Derby line, Vermont border checkpoint, received an FBI stop order at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Kane was arrested at 3:42, less than half a mile from the Canadian border. He did not get far. Sawyer did not watch the arrest. While Kane was being handcuffed at Derby line, Sawyer was inside the lumber warehouse, carrying his mother. He slipped one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her from the wooden chair where she had sat for nearly 2 days. She was lighter than he expected, so light that he almost lost his balance because he had used too much strength. How much did she weigh now? How much weight had she lost without him noticing? How many meals had she skipped because she forgot? How many pounds had fallen from her body while he was busy building a fake floor and approving execution files in the basement? Maggie rested her head against his shoulder. She said nothing as he carried her across the main floor, past bullet marks on the wall, past the 2 Kane men tied up on the floor, past the collapsed wooden racks, through the broken front door. She closed her eyes and leaned against her son's shoulder, and he did not know whether she was lucid or drifting back into the fog Alzheimer's had made for her. When they reached the gravel lot and the morning sun fell over them, she opened her eyes. She looked at the sky. She looked at the maple forest around them. Then she said, "Can you take me back to Cedar Hollow? I want to make beef stew." Sawyer held his mother tighter. "Yes, Mom. Anywhere you want." Bennett stood beside the car, his left shoulder wrapped in a white bandage, blood seeping lightly through the cloth. He watched Sawyer carry Maggie out of the warehouse. Morning sunlight fell across them both, the 72-year-old mother resting her head on the shoulder of the man holding her, and Bennett stood there, his hands hanging at his sides, his eyes red. He did not cry. Bennett Crane did not cry, but his eyes were red, and he did not try to hide it, because for the first time after years of killing and obeying orders, he understood why someone might choose to live differently, not because they feared death, not because they wanted more money or more power, but because there was a 72-year-old woman, just kidnapped, just rescued, and the first thing she said was not, "Save me," or, "I'm scared, but I want to make beef stew." Bennett opened the car door so Sawyer could place Maggie in the back seat. He closed the door gently, more gently than he had ever closed any door in his life, because inside was an old woman with her eyes closed, and he did not want to wake her. 3 months later, the 4th floor of the Corsetti Holdings building in Boston no longer existed. Not because it had been torn down, Only because no one moved the desks and chairs out anymore. No one turned on the computers anymore. No one put on a navy suit and round-framed glasses anymore. Mother Protocol ended the day Maggie saw the gun in her son's hand inside the lumber warehouse in Coos County, and there was no reason to start it again. Sawyer handed day-to-day operations over to Finch, not leaving the organization, because no one left the organization in the literal sense. Not in this world. Not when his name sat on every contract and every oath. But he stepped back. He kept a strategic role from a distance, approved major decisions through encrypted phone calls, and met Finch every 2 weeks at a neutral location. Finch did not object. Finch understood that Sawyer had not gone soft. Sawyer was doing something very few people in this world had enough power to do, choosing distance. As for Greer Whitfield, his betrayal was dealt with according to the finality of the system. He was permanently exiled from the East Coast, stripped of every asset, and left with a warning that any return would mean a shadow he could never outrun. Sawyer bought the wooden house in Cedar Hollow. He bought it with legal money, through Corsetti Holdings, the real estate division, properly by law, properly by taxes, properly by paperwork. Finch handled every procedure. The house was repaired, a new roof, a new kitchen, polished wooden floors. But the structure stayed the same. The red brick fireplace stayed the same. The pine bookshelf stayed the same. The coat hook behind the door stayed the same. Maggie did not recognize that the house had been repaired. She walked in and said, "It's still the same, exactly as she had the first time." And Sawyer did not correct her. Maggie lived in Cedar Hollow. Alzheimer's was still there, still erasing, still taking, still making her forget where she was in the morning and forget what she had eaten by noon. But here, when she forgot among walls her hands remembered, among the scent of oak her nose remembered, among the sound of Walt knocking every morning to ask if she needed anything, a sound her ears remembered. She forgot more safely. She forgot in a place where everything around her helped her forget more slowly, because here her body had more things to hold on to than it had in the Boston apartment, where everything was new, and no memory was old enough for Alzheimer's not to have touched it yet. Lorelei knew who Sawyer was, not because he told her. He had told her, exactly as he had promised, after bringing Maggie home safely. He sat with her at Blythe's at 9 o'clock at night, after the diner closed, after Blythe left them the key and went home. He told her everything. No softening, no dressing it up. The organization, the basement, the people who had died because of his orders. Money, power, blood. Lorelei sat and listened. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not walk out. She listened to it all, then stood up, said, "I need to think," and went home. She did not contact him for 11 days. 11 days that Sawyer counted day by day, hour by hour, and realized that 11 days of Lorelei not speaking to him hurt more than any bullet wound he had ever taken. On the 12th day, she knocked on the door of the wooden house. Not to say she forgave him. She said she did not forgive him, because it was not her place to forgive him for what he had done to other people. She said she was choosing to stay because she had seen both versions of him, the version holding a gun and the version holding a hammer, and she believed that which version was the real him was his right, but which version he chose to be when he was with her was her right. Then there was the money. Sawyer had paid off Lorelei's $12,000 debt to Harlan, quietly, without asking, without telling her. He called Finch. Finch called a lawyer. The lawyer called Harlan, and the debt disappeared in one day. Lorelei found out when Harlan did not come to collect at the beginning of the month. She called Harlan. Harlan said, "Someone paid it all." She knew immediately who it was. She went to the wooden house, and the fiercest argument in Cedar Hollow since Walt disputed a boundary line with his neighbor in 1997 broke out in Sawyer's kitchen. Lorelei did not yell. She was not the yelling type. She spoke, her voice cold, clear, each word cutting like a blade. "I did not ask you to pay it. I did not need you to pay it. That was my debt. Mine. You had no right to take away the only thing I was handling by myself." Sawyer said he only wanted to help. Lorelei said she did not need the kind of help she had not been asked about first. She said she would pay back every cent. She said that if he thought money could buy her gratitude, then he did not understand her, half as well as he thought he did. Sawyer stayed silent. He did not argue, not because he was afraid of her, but because he knew she was right. Lorelei opened a flower shop, small, on the corner of Main Street, between the post office and Walt's general store. She used her own savings, the money she had earned waiting tables for 3 years, along with a small loan from Blythe, which Blythe gave without interest because the girl has been through enough. She painted the walls herself, built the shelves herself, and grew flowers in the small greenhouse out back. Sawyer did not interfere. He did not invest. He did not suggest. He did not send more money. He was only her most loyal customer, coming in every week to buy a bouquet to bring home to Maggie, paying exactly the price written on the tag, not a cent more. And every week, when he placed the money on the counter, Lorelei counted it, gave him the change, and looked at him with an expression he had learned to read. Not forgiveness, not anger, but respect. She was paying back the $12,000. Slowly, month by month, from flour money and waitress wages. And every time she handed him a thin envelope at the end of the month, he accepted it, did not refuse, did not say there was no need, because he had come to understand that accepting that repayment was the only way to respect her. Bennett Crane asked to transfer to Cedar Hollow. Not dismissal, not exile. He asked for it himself. He told Finch he wanted to oversee regional security, and Finch understood that regional security meant guarding Maggie, guarding the wooden house, and living in a town of 2,000 people, where no one knew what his real name was. Bennett rented a room at the inn beside the post office. He learned plumbing from Walt, because the pipes in Cedar Hollow were old and often broke, and because Walt needed someone to help, and because Bennett needed to do something with his hands that had nothing to do with guns. He still greeted Maggie every morning when she went for her walk. "Hello, Aunt Maggie." Exactly the same line he had spoken on the 4th floor of the fake company. But now, there was no mother protocol. No navy suit. No round-framed glasses. Only Bennett Crane, 29 years old, standing in front of Walt's general store with a cup of coffee in his hand, greeting an old woman as she passed because he wanted to greet her, not because anyone had ordered him to. And Maggie, every morning, smiled and said, "That boy is so polite. His parents must have raised him well." She said that every morning, because she forgot she had said it the day before, but Bennett never minded, because every time she said it, it was still true. Morning, the kitchen of the wooden house. December sunlight in Vermont was weaker than September sunlight, but still strong enough to slip through the kitchen window and spread a long golden streak across the newly polished oak floor. Maggie stood at the stove. She was wearing the floral apron Sawyer's grandmother had once worn. The apron someone had washed clean and hung behind the kitchen door. At some point no one remembered. She was cooking. She did not remember the name of the dish she was making. That morning, she had asked Sawyer 3 times, "What am I cooking again?" And all 3 times Sawyer had said, "Beef stew, Mom." And all 3 times she had nodded and then forgotten. But her hands remembered. Her hands knew how to cut the potatoes into cubes just the right size. Her hands knew the amount of salt measured by 3 fingertips. Her hands knew the stewing time by listening to the simmer, with no clock, no need to remember, only the need to listen. 40 years of cooking this dish had turned it into something that lived in the bones instead of the mind, and Alzheimer's had not yet found a way to take what lived in the bones. Sawyer sat at the kitchen table, black coffee, white ceramic mug, like the cups at Blythe's, because Lorelei had brought home a set of 6 at some point when no one was paying attention. He sat there, his back against the chair, his eyes watching his mother cook, and he did nothing at all. He did not read files. He did not approve reports. He did not give orders to anyone. He only sat. Lorelei sat beside him. Her hair was still damp from the shower, loose over the shoulders of her gray sweater, the scent of shampoo mingling with the smell of beef stew. She was reading the local paper, the Cedar Hollow Gazette, 4 pages, printed once a week, and the biggest news in this issue was the upcoming winter fair and Walt Pemberton looking for someone to help set up the booths. She read silently, her lips moving slightly, and every now and then she gave a soft laugh because someone in the classified section was selling a gentle horse, good at standing still, likes carrots. Outside the window, Bennett and Walt were chopping and stacking firewood for the harsh winter. Preparing the woodpile in Cedar Hollow was a quiet, necessary ritual, a chore that brought a sense of grounded warmth to the snow-dusted yard. Walt sawed, Bennett held, the same rhythm Sawyer and Walt had found in September, only now Bennett's hands had grown more familiar with the work. He knew how to hold the hammer correctly, knew how to drive a nail without striking it 3 times. Walt spoke little. Bennett spoke even less. The 2 men worked beside each other beneath the winter sun, their breath rising in white smoke, and they did not need to say anything because the work spoke for itself. Maggie carried the pot from the stove to the table. She ladled beef stew onto plates, set one in front of Sawyer, set one in front of Lorelei, then filled two more for Walt and Bennett when they came inside. She placed Sawyer's plate down, looked at him, and said, "Eat, sweetheart." Sawyer looked at the plate. Beef stew. Like every time. Like that first dinner in Cedar Hollow, when she cooked in the wooden kitchen and told the story of his father proposing with a ring that had cost half a month's wages. Like every Tuesday lunchbox on the 4th floor of the fake company. Like the little note that said, "Mom loves you, remember to eat it all." Like the last lunchbox she had made the night before she was taken. The same dish, the same hands, the same woman. "Thank you, Mom," he said. Maggie looked at him, tilted her head slightly, and said in the voice 30 years of teaching had forged, the kind of voice that allowed no politeness to stand in her kitchen where love should be accepted as naturally as breathing. "You don't need to thank me for cooking. That's my job." Then she turned back to the stove. She began washing the pot. And while she washed, she sang. A song whose name she did not remember, whose words she did not remember. Only the melody. An old melody, perhaps from when she was young, perhaps from when she was teaching and singing to her 3rd-grade children every Friday afternoon. She did not remember the words, but she remembered the melody, because some things the body keeps even after the mind lets go. Under the table, Lorelei reached her hand to the left and took Sawyer's hand. She did not look at him. Her eyes were still on the newspaper, on the classified section, on the horse that liked carrots, but her hand held his, and he held hers back, and neither of them needed to look at the other to know that the hand was there. Sawyer's phone vibrated in his pocket. He took it out. The screen read, "Finch, the other world, the other empire, the other basement." It was still there, still running, still waiting, still demanding. He looked at the screen for 1 second. Then he placed the phone face down on the table. He picked up his fork. He ate the beef stew his mother had cooked. The phone kept vibrating, kept waiting. He would pick it up. He knew he would pick it up. Because he was not a man who could leave completely. Because that world did not allow anyone to leave completely. Because the name Corsetti would always carry a weight he could not set down. But not now. Right now was beef stew. It was December morning sunlight on the oak floor. It was Lorelei's hand in his under the table. It was the sound of Walt and Bennett hammering outside in the yard. It was the sound of his mother singing a song whose name she did not remember, but whose melody she did. It was the hot plate of food in front of him, cooked by hands that had forgotten nearly everything in the world but had not forgotten how to cook for her son. It is the story of a son kneeling before his mother and telling the truth, of a mother touching her son's face and saying, "I've known for a long time," of two people pretending for each other for 5 years only because neither wanted to lose 1 hour of eating together every week. It is about a poor girl in a small town who found the clue an entire empire could not find, not with guns or money, but by listening and looking, because her grandmother had taught her that looking at people's hands tells you more than looking at their mouths. It is about a young killer standing in a garden watering plants no one told him to water, and one day realizing he wanted to live differently. Life does not always give us the chance to start over from the beginning, but sometimes it gives us a meal, a porch, a sunlit afternoon, and if we are brave enough to sit down, put down what we are holding, and eat that meal, then maybe, just maybe, that is already a new beginning. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you think of someone in your own life, a mother, a father, someone who pretended to be strong so you wouldn't worry, or someone you pretended to be all right for so they wouldn't be sad, then please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories like this every day. Please press like if you felt it, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way someone looks at their day. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Which moment touched you the most? Is there someone in your life you have been acting for, or someone who has been acting for you, simply because of love? Please leave a comment below. Share what you feel from deep within your heart. We read every line and treasure every story you entrust to us. We wish everyone watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.